In this video, we'll review some of the techniques used in Mastercam to trim entities. On the screen are 6 different examples I'm going to use. Trim 1 entity, trim 2 entities, trim 3 entities, trimming to a point, divide, and the last one, close arc. I'm going to modify the right side geometry to match the left side. First though, I'm going to zoom in on our first example, trim 1 entity. I'm going to move on up to the top and pick the toolbar icon, zoom window, and draw a window around this first example. Next I'm going to move into edit, trim break, and then pick trim break. Now before I start to trim, how do we get help on this particular function? Well, I'm going to move over to the right of this ribbon bar and click on help. And here we are in help with information on the trim, extend, break ribbon bar. I'm going to click on button definitions, and then I'm going to click on trim 1 entity. So don't forget, help is just a few clicks away. I'm going to close this window down. Now for this first example we're going to use trim 1 entity, so I'm going to move over to the left of this ribbon bar and pick trim 1 entity. So on the left is the completed entities, and on the right these are the entities that we need to trim. So for this prompt, select the entity to trim extend. What I'm going to do is pick this line and then move over to the right, and for the next prompt pick this line, and as you can see they've successfully trimmed up. I'm going to move up top and pick fit and zoom in on our next example, trim 2 entities. Over on the ribbon bar I'm going to pick trim 2 entities. Now for the first prompt, select the entity to trim. Well, what we need to do is trim this line back to this line, and we need to trim this part of the line back to this line. Select the entity to trim extend. I'm going to pick this line on the left hand side of the other line, and now for the next prompt, select the entity to trim extend to. I'm going to pick this line on the right hand side of this line. Now the key to using trim is to pick the entity on the side of the trimming curve you wish to keep. Let's move on up again and do a fit, and now I'm going to draw a window around this next example, trim 3 entities. So up on the ribbon bar I'm going to pick trim 3 entities, and over on the left is the finished product. So what we need to do is to trim this line back to this arc, this line back to this arc, and this arc needs to be trimmed back to this line, and at the top this part of the arc needs to be trimmed back to this line. So for the first prompt, select the first entity to trim. I'm going to pick the line on the left hand side of the arc, and for the next prompt I'm going to pick the line on the left hand side of the arc, and for the third prompt, select the entity to trim extend to. I'm going to move on over and pick the arc, and everything's trimmed successfully. Screen fit, and I'll zoom round, and next example, trimming to a point. Up on the ribbon bar I'm going to pick the icon trim to point. Now select the entity to trim extend. I'm going to pick the line, and for this next prompt I'm going to move on over and pick the point, and as you can see it's trimmed successfully. Screen fit again, zoom window, and I'm going to move round, and next example, divide. So on the left is the final product. On the right what we need to do is remove this part of the arc between this line and this line, and remove this top part of the arc from this line around to this line. So what I'm going to do is click on divide up on the ribbon bar. Now for this first prompt, select the curve to divide. I'm going to move on down and pick the arc between these two lines, and as you can see, it's been trimmed away successfully. Now for the next prompt, select the curve to divide. I'm going to move on up and pick the arc here, and as you can see, it's trimmed it from this line to this line. And what I'm going to do next for this next prompt is pick the arc here, and it's trimmed it perfectly. I've finished here, so I'm going to hit OK, do a screen fit, and our last example is close arc. So I'm going to zoom window and draw a window around this last example. I'm going to move up into edit, trim break, and then right at the very bottom, close arc. Now my first prompt, select an arc to convert to a full circle. What I'm going to do is pick this arc. Now the next step in this process is to move on up and click on End Selection, and that successfully closed that arc. I'm going to move on up and do a screen fit. Now that completes this video. Thanks for watching.